A single piece of jewelry can be a window to a past you never knew existed. Sarah Mitchell was 28 years old, and she was drowning, not in water, but in something far more suffocating. Medical bills that mounted like accusations, each one a reminder that her mother's life had a price tag she couldn't afford. $87,000. The number lived in her mind like a parasite, feeding on every moment of peace she tried to claim. It grew with each shift she worked at the Riverside Diner, each smile she forced for customers who left spare change as tips. Each night she lay awake calculating impossible math. Diana Mitchell was dying of cancer at Mercy Hospital, and every labored breath her mother took felt like sand slipping through Sarah's fingers. Across Portland, in a glass penthouse that overlooked the Willamette River like a throne surveying conquered territory, lived Eleanor Ashford. At 72, she was a kind of woman whose name appeared on hospital wings and museum plaques. Her wealth wasn't just money. It was armor, insulation from the messy realities that ordinary people navigated. She moved through charity galas and board meetings with the grace of someone who had never waited in line, never begged, never felt the particular terror of checking a bank account and finding it empty. To Portland's elite, Eleanor was untouchable, a marble statue of generosity wrapped in cashmere and old money. But this isn't a fairy tale about kindness rewarded or suffering redeemed. This is a story of how a silver bracelet, worn on an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, unraveled 3 generations of carefully constructed lies. It's about how a split-second observation in a greasy diner would expose a conspiracy that stretched from the red dirt of Oklahoma to the polished floors of Oregon's wealthiest circles. How a piece of jewelry smaller than a child's fist would save one woman's life while destroying another's carefully curated legacy. The truth, when finally surfaced, would prove that some secrets don't stay buried. They wait, they watch, they wear silver and turquoise and catch the morning light at exactly the wrong moment. The Riverside Diner smelled like burnt bacon grease and yesterday's coffee, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and hair long after your shift ended. It was 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and pale autumn light filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, casting long shadows across cracked vinyl booths held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. The floor was a checkerboard of black and white tiles, half of them chipped, telling the story of decades of footsteps that never paused long enough to notice the decay. Sarah moved through the morning rush with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about the movements years ago. Refill cup, clear plate, smile, repeat. Her feet ached in shoes she'd repaired 3 times with superglue and denial, but she couldn't afford new ones. Not when every dollar was earmarked for something more important than her comfort. Not when her mother's oncologist had used the word weeks in their last conversation, and it had hung in the air between them like a death sentence neither wanted to acknowledge. The exhaustion lived in her bones now. It wasn't the tiredness that sleep could fix. It was the soul-deep weariness of carrying impossible weight on shoulders that had already buckled twice. She'd taken on extra shifts at a second diner across town, working 16-hour days that blurred into one endless loop of coffee stains and forced pleasantries. But it still wasn't enough. It was never enough. Eleanor Ashford entered the Riverside Diner at exactly 7 o'clock, and she might as well have stepped out of a different dimension. Her camel cashmere coat probably cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. Pearl earrings caught the harsh fluorescent lights and transformed them into something almost elegant. She carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never been told no in any meaningful way, someone for whom the world rearranged itself without being asked. She took a corner booth. The kind of woman who could make cheap diner coffee seem dignified simply by the way she held the cup. There was an invisible curtain around her, a force field of privilege that made the tired linoleum and cracked vinyl seem like props in someone else's story, not hers. Sarah approached with her order pad and a smile that had stopped reaching her eyes months ago. She'd learned to make herself small around people like this, to become a pleasant shadow that took orders and disappeared. Rich people didn't like to be reminded that service workers were human, that they had lives and problems and breaking points. "Good morning, ma'am. What can I get you?" Eleanor glanced up, and for a moment, her pale blue eyes swept over Sarah with a casual assessment of someone evaluating furniture. Then she turned her attention to the laminated menu, and Sarah prepared to fade back into invisibility. That's when Sarah saw it. The bracelet on Eleanor's wrist was silver, delicate but substantial, with 7 turquoise stones set in an alternating pattern with tiny silver bells. The stones glowed with that particular blue-green that only genuine turquoise possessed, each one smooth and polished except. Sarah's breath caught. The 7th stone had a hairline crack running through its center like lightning frozen in time. Her hand trembled as she gripped her pen. The tremor started in her fingers and spread up her arm, through her chest, into the hollow space where her heart had suddenly forgotten how to beat properly. Because Sarah knew that bracelet. She knew the pattern of the stones and bells. She knew about the Cherokee blessing etched in flowing script along the inner band, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. She knew about the crack in the 7th stone. Her mother wore an identical bracelet. Not similar, identical. Sarah's hand wouldn't stop shaking. She gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles went white, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of what her eyes were telling her brain. The bracelet on Eleanor Ashford's wrist wasn't similar to her mother's. It wasn't inspired by it or made in the same style. It was identical down to microscopic details that no coincidence could explain. The pattern of the 7 turquoise stones alternated with the tiny silver bells in a sequence that Sarah had memorized since childhood. Stone, bell, stone, stone, bell, stone, bell, stone, stone, bell, stone. The filigree work wrapped around each stone in a distinctive pattern that looked like feathers or water or both, depending on how the light hit it. The silver had that particular warm glow that came from old metal, from something that had been worn against skin for decades, that had absorbed the oils and warmth of a human body until it became almost alive. But it was the crack in the 7th stone that sealed it. Not just any crack, a hairline fracture that ran diagonally from upper left to lower right, splitting the stone into 2 uneven sections like a tiny geological fault line. Sarah had traced that crack with her fingertip 1,000 times on her mother's bracelet, had listened to the story of how it happened on a Sunday morning in August 1985 when Rachel dropped it on the kitchen floor and cried for an hour because she thought she'd destroyed the most precious thing she owned. Her grandmother, Lily Whitehorse, had commissioned these bracelets from Joseph Blackbear, a master silversmith in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, in the spring of 1967. Sarah knew this the way other people knew their own birthdays. Lily had melted down family silver that had been passed through 4 generations, spoons and candlesticks and a tea service that her own grandmother had carried from North Carolina on the Trail of Tears. The turquoise stones came from her great-grandfather's mine outside Santa Fe, each one selected personally by Lily over the course of 3 months. She'd paid $340 for both bracelets, which was more money than her family had seen in one place in years. There were only 2 of these bracelets in existence. One belonged to Sarah's mother Diana. The other had belonged to Diana's sister Rachel. And Rachel had been dead for 40 years. Except the impossible was sitting on Eleanor Ashford's wrist, catching the fluorescent light, and throwing it back like proof of something Sarah's mind couldn't yet process. Eleanor's pale blue eyes studied Sarah with an intensity that made the younger woman feel like a specimen under glass. When Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice had the temperature of a walk-in freezer. This bracelet belonged to my mother. It's been in my family for generations. She set down her water glass with careful precision and reached for her Prada handbag, a bag that cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. From an inner pocket, she produced a small envelope containing what looked like official papers. She unfolded them on the table with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged, who expected documentation to end all discussions. Vintage jewelry appraisal, Eleanor said, sliding the papers toward Sarah like a lawyer presenting evidence. Dated 1988. As you can see, this piece is authenticated as a unique commission from the mid-20th century. One of a kind. Sarah's eyes scanned the paper. The letterhead looked official, Portland Estate Appraisals, established 1952. The description matched the bracelet exactly. Appraised value, $12,000. Unique piece, no known duplicates. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Herbert Morrison, master appraiser. But Sarah's mother had an identical bracelet sitting in a jewelry box at home. Not similar, identical. My mother has the same bracelet, Sarah repeated, her voice stronger now. Everything about it is the same. The stones, the bells, the pattern, even the crack in the seventh. Your mother is either mistaken or lying. Eleanor's words came out clipped and precise, each syllable a small act of violence. Perhaps she has something similar that she's convinced herself is identical. Perhaps she's told you stories that have grown in the telling. Or perhaps, Eleanor paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke, your mother acquired something that didn't belong to her and created a convenient story to explain its presence. The accusation landed like a slap. Sarah felt heat flood her face, felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Eleanor was calling her mother a liar, or worse, a thief. My mother would never. I'm sure you believe that. Eleanor's tone dripped with condescension, the way someone might speak to a child insisting on the existence of Santa Claus. Family loyalty is admirable, but facts are facts, and this bracelet has documented provenance. Your mother's story, I'm afraid, does not. Eleanor reached into her wallet and pulled out a $50 bill. She placed it on the table next to her untouched coffee cup with the kind of casual dismissal that only came from having so much money it stopped being real. The breakfast special cost $8. Keep the change, Eleanor said, already standing. Consider compensation for your confusion. The gesture was designed to humiliate, and it worked. $50 for an $8 breakfast wasn't generosity. It was an insult wrapped in currency, a way of saying that Sarah's dignity, her mother's honor, her entire existence could be purchased and dismissed with spare cash from a wealthy woman's wallet. Eleanor adjusted her cashmere coat and prepared to leave, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never faced consequences for walking away from uncomfortable situations. She was almost at the door when Sarah found her voice again. Wait. Eleanor paused but didn't turn around. The set of her shoulders suggested she was unaccustomed to being stopped mid-exit. I have my mother's bracelet at home, Sarah said, her voice carrying across the diner in a way that made the few other customers look up from their meals. I can bring it here. We can compare them. Now Eleanor turned. Her expression was ice and warning. I think it's best if you don't contact me again. I've been more than patient with your theories. But if you continue to harass me with baseless accusations, I'll be forced to involve my attorneys. Do you understand? The threat hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Sarah understood perfectly. Eleanor Ashford had lawyers the way normal people had kitchen utensils, in abundance and always within reach. One phone call and Sarah would be buried in legal paperwork she couldn't afford to fight. But Sarah also understood something else. She'd seen the flicker of fear in Eleanor's eyes when she first mentioned the bracelet. She'd seen the older woman's hand freeze, seen the way her pupils dilated just slightly before she locked down into cold authority. Eleanor Ashford was afraid of something, and people didn't threaten lawsuits over nothing. The diner manager, a tired man named Rick, who'd worked there longer than Sarah had been alive, approached as Eleanor swept out the door. He'd been wiping down the counter, but Sarah knew he'd heard everything. Everyone had heard everything. Sarah, Rick said quietly, I need you to be careful. Mrs. Ashford is a regular here, and she's rich, Sarah finished. I know. Important, Rick corrected. She donates to half the charities in Portland. She knows the mayor. She has the kind of friends who make problems disappear. He looked at her with something between concern and warning. Whatever you think you know about that bracelet, maybe it's better to just let it go. Don't harass the customers, especially not the ones who could shut this place down with a phone call. Sarah looked at the $50 bill, still sitting on the table. Hush money disguised as a tip, payment for silence, for accepting the official story, for knowing her place in a world where people like Eleanor Ashford wrote the rules and people like Sarah Mitchell follow them. She picked up the bill and tucked it into her apron pocket. But she didn't feel bought. She felt galvanized. I have the same bracelet at home, Sarah said, more to herself than to Rick. Mine is real, which means either hers is fake or something impossible had happened 40 years ago, and the truth was buried under enough money and time that no one thought it would ever surface. Sarah finished her shift in a fog, her mind spinning through possibilities that all seemed equally insane. When her replacement arrived at 2 in the afternoon, she clocked out and drove straight to the small apartment she shared with 2 roommates in Southeast Portland. She went to her bedroom and pulled out the wooden box where she kept the few precious things she owned. Her grandmother's wedding ring, some old photographs, and her mother's bracelet, which Diana had given to Sarah for safekeeping 3 months ago when the cancer made her hands too swollen to wear it. Sarah photographed the bracelet from every angle. She documented each stone, each bell, the inscription, the crack. She measured it, weighed it on her kitchen scale, wrote down every detail she could think of in a notebook that was quickly filling with questions that had no answers. Then she looked up Eleanor Ashford online and started digging for the truth, not knowing that the truth she was about to uncover would be far more devastating than anything she could have imagined. Mercy Hospital smelled like industrial disinfectant, fighting a losing battle against death and despair. Sarah walked the familiar path to her mother's room on the oncology ward, her shoes squeaking against linoleum that was cleaned 3 times a day, but never felt clean. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and the autumn sun was already thinking about setting, casting long shadows through the institutional windows that made everything look like it was underwater. Diana Mitchell's room was at the end of the hall, room 407, a number Sarah had come to hate with the kind of visceral loathing most people reserved for their worst enemies. She paused outside the door, steeling herself for what she knew she'd see, for what got worse every day, despite the doctor's careful optimism and the nurse's professional smiles. Her mother was 53 years old, but looked 70. The cancer had eaten away everything soft about her, leaving behind angles and shadows where curves used to be. She wore an oxygen mask that covered the lower half of her face, and the sound of her breathing was mechanical and labored, like something broken trying desperately to keep working. A morphine drip fed into her left arm through an 4 that bruised the paper-thin skin around the needle site. Her skin had taken on a yellow tinge that the doctors called jaundice, a sign that her liver was beginning to fail along with everything else. Diana's eyes were closed, but Sarah knew she wasn't really sleeping. The cancer had stolen that too. Real sleep, the kind that actually restored something instead of just passing time between pain medication doses. "Hey, Mom," Sarah said softly, pulling a chair close to the bed. Diana's eyes opened slowly, taking a moment to focus. When she saw Sarah, something like relief passed across her face. Her hand moved slightly on the blanket, and Sarah took it, careful of the 4 line and the bruises that bloomed like dark flowers across her mother's arms. "How was work?" Diana's voice came out muffled through the oxygen mask, thin and reedy like wind through a crack in a window. It was fine. The lie tasted like ash, but Sarah had gotten good at lying about fine. Everything was fine. The bills were fine. The job was fine. The crushing weight of watching her mother die in installments was fine. Dr. Reeves appeared in the doorway with the kind of expression that doctors spent years learning to wear, professionally sympathetic, but emotionally distant enough to survive their shifts. She was in her 40s, competent and direct in a way that Sarah appreciated even when the news was bad, which was always, "Sarah, can I speak with you for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, and Dr. Reeves didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've reviewed your mother's latest scans. The tumors have continued to grow despite the current treatment protocol. At this rate, she has perhaps 3 weeks, maybe a month at most." 3 weeks. Sarah felt the number settle into her chest like stone. "However," Dr. Reeves continued, "there's an experimental treatment trial at Oregon Health Sciences University. It's showing promising results for late-stage pancreatic cancer. The survival rate is still low, but it's given some patients additional quality time, and in a few cases, significant tumor reduction." Hope flared in Sarah's chest before she could stop it. "What do we need to do?" "The treatment isn't covered by insurance because it's still experimental. The cost would be approximately $120,000 for the full course, and we'd need to start within the next 2 weeks to have any chance of effectiveness." The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. $120,000. Sarah made $26,000 a year before taxes. She already owed $87,000 to this hospital for treatments that hadn't worked. She had $1,200 in her checking account and a credit card that was maxed out at $5,000. "I see," Sarah managed. Dr. Reeves put a hand on her shoulder with the kind of practiced compassion that came from delivering impossible news multiple times a day. "I'm sorry. I know it's not fair, but I wanted you to know the option exists, in case there's any way to make it work. Financial aid, fundraising, family support, anything." "Family support." Sarah almost laughed. Her father had left when she was 6. She had no siblings. Her mother's sister had been dead for 40 years. Except maybe she wasn't. Sarah returned to her mother's bedside and sat in the chair that was becoming as familiar as her own bed. Diana was awake now, watching her daughter with eyes that held too much understanding. Bad news? Diana asked, though it wasn't really a question. They have a new treatment that might help. Experimental thing, but it's expensive. How expensive? It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. Diana's hand tightened weakly around Sarah's fingers. Baby, don't bankrupt yourself trying to buy me time. I'm tired. I'm so tired. Don't talk like that, Sarah. Diana's voice was firm despite its weakness. I need you to promise me something. When I'm gone, don't spend the rest of your life drowning in my medical debt. You're 28 years old. You deserve a life that isn't defined by what you couldn't save. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. Not here. Not in front of her mother, who had enough to carry without adding her daughter's grief to the weight. Mom, can I ask you about Aunt Rachel? The change in Diana's expression was immediate and profound. The exhaustion remained, but something else flickered beneath it. Old pain that had never quite healed. Grief that had calcified into permanent scar tissue. Why are you asking about Rachel? Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed her mother the photos she'd taken of Eleanor Ashford's bracelet. Diana's eyes widened, and even through the oxygen mask, Sarah could see her mother's breathing quicken. Where did you see this? Diana's voice had gone sharp with something that sounded like fear. A woman came into the diner this morning wearing it. She said it belonged to her mother, that it's one of a kind. But Mom, it's identical to yours, down to the crack in the 7th stone. Diana was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photo like it was a ghost made visible. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, caught somewhere between present and past. My mother made those bracelets for Rachel and me when I was 16 and Rachel was 14. She melted down everything silver our family had, spoons, candlesticks, even her own wedding ring. Took it all to Joseph Black Bear in Tahlequah and asked him to make something that would bind us together no matter how far apart life took us. Diana's fingers moved unconsciously to her wrist, even though the bracelet wasn't there anymore, even though Sarah had it now. The gesture was automatic, decades of muscle memory reaching for comfort that had become as natural as breathing. The turquoise came from my great-grandfather's mine. Mama spent 3 months picking out stones that matched perfectly. Same color, same clarity, same size. Joseph worked on those bracelets for the better part of a year, made them by hand, every link, every detail. When he finished them, he said they were the finest pieces he'd ever created. Sarah waited, sensing there was more, that her mother was working her way toward something painful. Rachel disappeared September 19th, 1985. She was 23 years old. Said she was driving to Seattle to visit a friend, but her car was found abandoned on Highway 101 3 days later. No sign of Rachel. No blood, no struggle, just her car with the keys still in the ignition and her purse still on the passenger seat. Diana's voice cracked slightly. The police said she probably wandered into the woods and got lost, or maybe jumped from one of the cliffs. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. Eventually, they declared her legally dead, ruled it a presumed suicide. My mother died 6 months later. I think losing Rachel killed her faster than any disease could have. But what if Rachel didn't die? Sarah asked quietly. What if she's alive? What if this woman, Eleanor Ashford, what if she's Rachel? Diana's hand gripped Sarah's with surprising strength. Don't. Some doors are best left closed, baby. Rachel is gone. She's been gone for 40 years. Whatever you think you saw, whatever coincidence made you think that bracelet is Rachel's, just let it go. But Mom, promise me. Diana's eyes were fierce now, burning with an intensity that the cancer hadn't managed to extinguish. Promise me you won't dig into this. Nothing good can come from resurrecting ghosts. Sarah looked at her dying mother and made a promise she had no intention of keeping. Okay, I promise. But after Diana had fallen back into her restless half-sleep, after the nurses had made their evening rounds and Sarah had finally left the hospital as visiting hours ended, she sat in her car in the parking lot and made a different promise. This one to herself. I'll find out the truth, she whispered to the empty car, to the darkening sky, to whatever gods might be listening. If there's even a chance that Aunt Rachel is alive, if there's any way this connects to getting Mom the treatment she needs, I'm going to find it. She pulled out her phone and started researching Eleanor Ashford in earnest, not knowing that the truth she was about to uncover would be far stranger and more dangerous than a simple case of mistaken identity. She didn't know that Eleanor Ashford's perfect life was built on 40 years of carefully constructed lies, or that powerful men had spent decades ensuring those lies stayed buried. All Sarah knew was that her mother was dying, that an impossible bracelet had appeared on a stranger's wrist, and that somewhere in the space between those two facts lived a truth that might change everything. The question was whether that truth would save her mother's life or destroy what little remained of it. Sarah's apartment smelled like old carpet, and the Chinese takeout her roommate had forgotten to throw away 3 days ago. It was past midnight, and she sat cross-legged on her bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, diving into the internet's memory of Eleanor Ashford like an archaeologist excavating a burial site. The official story was immaculate, almost too perfect in its completeness. Eleanor Hartley was born in Boston in 1953 to Marcus and Catherine Hartley, old money that had made its fortune in shipping during the previous century. Boarding schools in Connecticut, a brief stint at Wellesley College that she'd left after 2 years for undisclosed personal reasons. Then a gap of almost 15 years where Eleanor seemed to exist only in society page photographs, charity events, museum openings, the occasional mention in columns about Boston's elite. She'd married Thomas Ashford in 1987. He was a Portland industrialist, 20 years her senior, a widower whose timber fortune had survived the industry's decline through strategic diversification into real estate and technology. The wedding was small, private, almost secretive for people of their social standing. Eleanor had moved to Portland, assumed the role of philanthropist and society wife, and lived there ever since. Thomas Ashford had died in 2018 at the age of 93. He'd left his entire estate, estimated at over $40 million, to Eleanor, despite having a son from his first marriage. The son, Thomas Ashford Jr., had contested the will briefly but dropped the challenge within weeks. No children of her own. No family mentioned except the deceased parents in Boston. The official story was airtight. It was also completely fabricated. Sarah found the first crack at 2:15 in the morning, her eyes burning from staring at the screen, her third cup of coffee going cold on the nightstand. She'd been searching public records databases, cross-referencing Eleanor Hartley's supposed birth in Boston in 1953. Massachusetts had excellent record-keeping, especially for wealthy families whose births were announced in newspapers and filed with meticulous care. There was no birth certificate for Eleanor Hartley, born in Boston in 1953 to Marcus and Catherine Hartley. Sarah tried variations, different spellings, nearby towns, adjacent years. Nothing. She searched Boston society pages from the 1950s and 60s for any mention of the Hartley family. The name appeared exactly 3 times, all referring to a different family entirely, one whose daughter Eleanor had died of polio in 1956 at the age of 6. Eleanor Ashford didn't exist before 1986. The discovery sent electricity down Sarah's spine. She cross-referenced further, finding Eleanor's first official document, a driver's license issued in Oregon in November 1986, then a marriage license in May 1987. Before that, nothing. No tax records, no credit history, no paper trail of any kind for a woman who supposedly came from old Boston money. People didn't just materialize at age 33 with a completely fabricated past and marry into one of Portland's wealthiest families. Something had happened. Something significant enough that Eleanor Hartley needed to be created from nothing. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she opened another browser tab and searched for her mother's family. The Whitehorse family had deep roots in Oklahoma, Cherokee heritage that stretched back centuries, and plenty of documentation to prove it. She found her grandmother Lily's obituary from 1986, died of a broken heart 6 months after her youngest daughter Rachel disappeared. Found her grandfather's death certificate from 1979. Found birth certificates for Diana Mitchell, born 1972, and Rachel Whitehorse, born 1962. Rachel would be 63 years old now if she were still alive. Eleanor Ashford claimed to be 72, but looked younger, moved like someone in their early 60s, had the kind of preserved elegance that came from expensive skincare and probably some discreet surgical work. Sarah pulled out the box of her mother's photographs from a closet. The ones Diana kept meaning to organize into albums, but never had the energy for. She found what she was looking for near the bottom. A photograph taken in August 1984, just over a year before Rachel disappeared. Diana and Rachel stood together in front of their mother's house in Tahlequah, both wearing summer dresses, both wearing their silver bracelets, both smiling at the camera with their arms around each other. Rachel was 22 in this photo, young and beautiful, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that held some private amusement. Diana was 12, still gangly and awkward, looking at her older sister with unconcealed adoration. Sarah held the photograph next to her laptop screen, where she had Eleanor Ashford's most recent charity gala photo pulled up. She looked at the bone structure, the set of the eyes, the particular way the mouth curved at the corners. 40 years of aging separated these images, but the fundamental architecture was the same. The resemblance wasn't just possible, it was undeniable. Rachel Whitehorse hadn't died on Highway 101 in September 1985. She disappeared, erased her identity, and re-emerged a year later as Eleanor Hartley from Boston, a woman with a completely manufactured past. The question was why? What could make someone fake their own death, abandon their family, and live under a false identity for 40 years? And what did Thomas Ashford have to do with it? Sarah found the old newspaper articles about Rachel's disappearance in the digital archives of the Oregonian. The coverage was sparse. A missing person report filed by Lily Whitehorse, a brief mention when Rachel's car was found abandoned, a follow-up piece 3 weeks later when the search was called off. The police had treated it as a voluntary disappearance or suicide. No evidence of foul play. No reason to investigate further. But one line in the last article caught Sarah's attention. Whitehorse was last seen at a rest stop near Lincoln City, where surveillance footage showed her speaking with an unidentified man in the parking lot before driving away alone. An unidentified man. Sarah read the line 3 times, feeling something click into place in her mind. She searched for more details about the surveillance footage, but found nothing. The case had been closed quickly, the footage apparently lost or deemed unimportant. Just another young woman who decided to disappear into the woods or the ocean. Another tragedy that was easier to file away than investigate. By 4 in the morning, Sarah had assembled a timeline that made her stomach hurt. Rachel disappeared in September 1985. Eleanor Hartley appeared in Oregon in November 1986. Thomas Ashford's wife had died in March 1986. He'd married Eleanor 14 months later. A whirlwind courtship for a man in his 60s who'd supposedly been devoted to his first wife. The pieces were there. They just didn't make sense yet. Why would Rachel fake her death? Why would Thomas Ashford marry a woman with a manufactured identity? What was the connection? Sarah fell asleep with her laptop still open, her mind churning through possibilities, none of them good. She woke 3 hours later to her phone alarm and dragged herself through another shift at the diner, her body on autopilot while her mind stayed stuck on Eleanor Ashford and the mystery of the bracelet. She decided on a plan during the sleepless hours before dawn. She would confront Eleanor again, but this time in public, where the woman couldn't simply threaten lawyers and walk away. The Portland Museum was hosting its annual autumn gala that evening, a $500 per plate fundraiser for the museum's new wing. Eleanor Ashford was listed as one of the event's primary sponsors, which meant she would definitely be there, probably holding court among Portland's elite, like the queen she pretended to be. Sarah didn't have $500 for a ticket, but the museum stayed open to the general public until 7, and the gala didn't start until 8. She finished her shift at the diner, went home to change into the only semi-formal dress she owned, a black number she'd bought for a wedding 3 years ago, and drove to the museum with her mother's bracelet in her purse and a plan that was probably stupid but felt necessary. The museum was beautiful in the autumn evening light, its modern architecture glowing against the darkening sky. Sarah paid her $12 admission and wandered the galleries, watching as staff prepared the grand hall for the evening's event. Tables draped in white linen, flowers that probably cost more than her monthly rent, a string quartet warming up in the corner. She saw Eleanor arrive at 7:30, swept in on a wave of expensive perfume and a kind of confidence that came from knowing every door would open for you. She wore midnight blue silk that probably cost more than Sarah's car, and diamonds sparkled at her throat like captured stars. She moved through the space, greeting people by name, air-kissing cheeks, laughing at jokes that Sarah was too far away to hear. Sarah waited until Eleanor was momentarily alone, speaking with a museum curator near the new contemporary art exhibit. Then she walked up, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, and spoke before she could lose her nerve. "Mrs. Ashford, I need to speak with you about Rachel Whitehorse." The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Eleanor's face went absolutely white, the kind of pale that looked almost gray in the gallery lighting. Her hand reached out and gripped the curator's arm, as if she might fall without the support. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped, and Sarah saw raw terror underneath. Then the mask snapped back into place, and Eleanor's expression went cold and hard as marble. "I don't know who that is, and I told you not to contact me again." "Security," Eleanor called out, her voice sharp and commanding. Two men in dark suits appeared, as if they'd been waiting for exactly this kind of disruption. They probably had been. People like Eleanor Ashford didn't attend public events without private security. "This woman is harassing me," Eleanor said, her voice carrying just enough volume that nearby patrons turned to look. "Please escort her out and ensure she doesn't return." Sarah felt hands grip her arms, professional but firm, already guiding her toward the exit. She pulled out her phone with her free hand and held up the photograph of Rachel and Diana from 1984. "Then explain why you're wearing Rachel Whitehorse's bracelet," Sarah called out as security pulled her away. "Explain why you have no records before 1986. Explain why you look exactly like." "That's enough," one of the security guards said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone who would remove her by force if necessary. Sarah let them escort her out, knowing she'd already accomplished what she came for. She'd seen Eleanor's face when she mentioned Rachel's name. She'd seen the fear, the recognition, the split second of panic before the rich woman's armor locked back into place. But she'd also made a critical error. As the security guards deposited her on the sidewalk outside the museum with a warning not to return, Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind them, her face composed now, but her eyes glacial. "I try to be patient with you," Eleanor said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that only Sarah could hear. "I understood that you were confused, possibly mentally unwell. But if you continue to harass me with these delusional accusations, I will have no choice but to take legal action. I will obtain a restraining order. I will pursue charges of stalking and defamation. And I promise you, I have the resources to make your life very, very difficult." "How did you know?" Sarah asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Know what? That my family is from Oklahoma. I never mentioned Oklahoma at the diner. But you knew. You mentioned it before I did." Eleanor's face went still again, and Sarah saw her realize the mistake she'd made. For just an instant, something flickered in those pale eyes. Not fear this time, but something almost like resignation, like someone who'd been running for so long they were almost relieved to finally be caught. "Stay away from me," Eleanor said finally. "This is your last warning." She turned and walked back into the museum, back into her life of silk dresses and charity galas and carefully constructed lies. But Sarah stood on the sidewalk, holding her phone and her mother's bracelet, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was right. Eleanor Ashford was Rachel Whitehorse. Her aunt was alive, and somewhere in the 40 years between Rachel's disappearance and this moment lived a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. The question that kept Sarah awake for the rest of that night was simple and terrifying. What truth was worth abandoning your family and living a lie for 4 decades? And what would happen when that truth finally came to light? Sarah spent the next 3 days living in a fog of obsession and caffeine, working her shifts at the diner while her mind stayed locked on Eleanor Ashford and the impossible bracelet. She'd photographed both bracelets from every conceivable angle, documented every detail, created spreadsheets comparing measurements and specifications. But documentation wasn't proof, and proof was what she needed if she was going to uncover whatever truth Eleanor was hiding. She was closing the diner on Thursday night, counting out the register while the cook mopped the kitchen, when a man walked in just as she was about to lock the door. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that suggested money, but not the ostentatious kind that Eleanor Ashford wore like armor. Expensive watch, tailored suit, but both worn with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove anything. His face had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from outdoor hobbies and good genes, and his eyes held an intelligence that felt calculating without being cold. "We're closed," Sarah said, her hand still on the door lock. "I know. I'm Thomas Ashford." He extended his hand with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thomas Ashford, Jr. I believe you've met my stepmother." Sarah's hand froze halfway to the handshake. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that Eleanor had sent her stepson to threaten her with lawyers or worse. But Thomas's expression held something that looked almost like desperation, and he made no move to come further inside. "She doesn't know I'm here," Thomas said, as if reading her mind. "In fact, she'd probably have me disowned if she found out I was talking to you. Can we speak somewhere private?" They ended up in a booth at the back of the empty diner, 2 cups of reheated coffee between them that neither of them touched. Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a photograph, Eleanor Ashford standing next to an older man who had to be Thomas Ashford Sr., taken at what looked like a charity event maybe 10 years ago. "My father married Eleanor in 1987 when I was 12 years old," Thomas began, his voice careful and measured. "My mother had died the year before, and I was angry about it. Angry that he was replacing her so quickly with this mysterious woman who appeared out of nowhere with no past and no family." Sarah leaned forward. "What do you mean, no past?" "I mean exactly that. Eleanor claimed to be from Boston from old money, but she had no friends from her supposed childhood, no family photos, no stories about growing up. It was like she materialized fully formed at age 33 with a manufactured biography and perfect manners." Thomas's fingers drummed against his coffee cup. "I tried to investigate when I was younger, tried to find records of the Hartley family she claimed to belong to. Found nothing. My father dismissed my concerns as a grieving child acting out." "But you never stopped looking?" "No." Thomas's expression darkened, "especially not after my father's death. He left her everything. $40 million, the house, the investments, everything. I got a token inheritance of $500,000 and a letter telling me to let it go, that Eleanor deserved the money for reasons he couldn't explain, but that I should trust him." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Did you contest the will?" "Briefly. Then Eleanor's lawyer, a man named Victor Castellano who'd been my father's business partner for decades, paid me a visit. He suggested very politely that if I dropped the challenge, I'd avoid a lengthy legal battle that would bankrupt me and destroy my father's reputation. He also suggested, less politely, that accidents happen to people who ask too many questions about Eleanor's past." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas continued, his voice dropping lower. "I dropped the challenge, but I never stopped wondering who she really was. Then 3 days ago, museum security called me about an incident at the Autumn Gala. A young woman making wild accusations about Eleanor being someone named Rachel Whitehorse, showing photographs, causing a scene." He looked at Sarah with eyes that held equal parts hope and fear. "I need to know if you're crazy or if you found what I've been looking for all these years." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed him everything. The photographs of both bracelets, the timeline she constructed, the newspaper articles about Rachel's disappearance, the image of young Rachel standing next to her sister in 1984. Thomas studied each piece with the intensity of someone examining evidence in a murder trial. "My God," he breathed finally. "You're right. The resemblance is undeniable. But I can't prove it," Sarah admitted. "I have theories and coincidences, but nothing that would hold up legally or force Eleanor to admit the truth." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his businessman's brain clearly working through possibilities and risks. When he spoke again, his voice held the kind of determination that came from decades of suppressed suspicion finally finding an outlet. "What if we could prove it? What if I gave you access to resources, private investigators, forensic experts, legal researchers? Everything you'd need to build an ironclad case." He leaned forward. "I have money. Not as much as Eleanor, but enough. And more importantly, I have a vested interest in uncovering the truth about who she really is and why my father left her everything." "Why would you help me?" Sarah asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Because if Eleanor Ashford is really Rachel Whitehorse living under a false identity, then her marriage to my father was built on fraud, which means her inheritance is invalid, which means I might actually get what my father intended me to have before Eleanor manipulated him." Thomas's expression hardened. And because I'm tired of living with the ghost of a woman whose past is a complete fabrication. I want the truth, whatever it is. Sarah thought about her mother dying in Mercy Hospital, about the $120,000 for experimental treatment that might buy Diana a few more months of life. She thought about Eleanor Ashford's threats and her icy certainty that Sarah would back down like everyone else had backed down for 40 years. Okay, Sarah said, let's find the truth. They shook hands across the table. Two people bound together by desperation and determination, neither of them fully understanding what they were about to unleash. The investigation began in earnest the next morning. Thomas hired a private investigator named Marcus Chin, a former FBI agent who specialized in identity fraud and cold cases. He also retained Dr. Patricia Reeves, not Sarah's mother's oncologist, but a different Dr. Reeves who ran a forensic authentication lab in Seattle that specialized in historical artifact verification. The bracelets became the first focus. Sarah brought her mother's bracelet to Dr. Reeves's lab, where it was photographed under microscopic detail, every millimeter documented and cataloged. Thomas arranged for Eleanor to be out of town at a medical conference in San Francisco. He had connections on the museum board who owed him favors. And during that window, Marcus Chin broke into Eleanor's penthouse and photographed her bracelet with the same meticulous detail. What Dr. Reeves discovered was damning in its precision. The bracelets weren't just similar. They were twins in every measurable way. The silver composition matched exactly, indicating they'd been poured from the same batch of melted metal. The filigree work showed identical tool marks, the signature of a single craftsman working in a distinctive style. The turquoise stones had been cut from the same geological formation, their chemical composition so perfectly matched that the probability of them coming from different sources was less than 1%. Most tellingly, the crack in the seventh stone on both bracelets showed identical fracture patterns under microscopic analysis. Not similar patterns, identical. The same stress point, the same directional force, the same moment of impact. These stones hadn't just cracked separately in similar ways. They'd been part of the same piece of turquoise that cracked and was then divided between the two bracelets. These pieces were created together, Dr. Reeves confirmed, showing Sarah and Thomas the detailed analysis. Same workshop, same materials, same time period. I'd stake my reputation on it. The historical research proved equally fruitful. Marcus Chin flew to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and spent 3 days in the Cherokee Nation Archives and the County Records Office. He found Joseph Blackbear's workshop records, meticulously kept in leather-bound ledgers that dated back to 1943. The entry for April 15, 1967, documented a commission from Lily Whitehorse. 2 matching bracelets, 7 turquoise stones each, Cherokee blessing inscription. Total cost $340, paid in installments over 6 months. Blackbear's original sketches were still there, tucked into the ledger like press flowers. The drawing showed every detail of the bracelet's design, the alternating pattern of stones and bells, the specific style of filigree work, even a note about the cracked stone that read, "Client insists on keeping despite flaw. Says it makes each piece unique." Marcus photographed everything, obtained certified copies from the Cherokee Nation Registrar, and returned to Portland with documentation that proved beyond doubt that only 2 of these bracelets had ever been made, both commissioned by Lily Whitehorse for her daughters Diana and Rachel. Next came the expert consultations. Thomas had connections throughout Portland's academic and specialist communities, and he used them ruthlessly. A Native American jewelry expert from the University of Oregon examined both bracelets and confirmed they matched the distinctive style of Joseph Blackbear's workshop during his most productive period. An independent appraiser looked at Eleanor's vintage authentication papers from 1988 and declared them forgeries. The paper stock was wrong for the claimed date. The signature didn't match Herbert Morrison's authenticated work from that period, and the appraisal methodology described was inconsistent with industry standards from that era. The Ashford Foundation Gala was the kind of event where Portland's elite gathered to feel good about themselves while writing tax-deductible checks. 400 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Sentinel Hotel, every one of them dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Crystal chandeliers threw light across tables draped in silk, and champagne flowed like water, while a live orchestra played music that no one really listened to. Victor Castellano stood at the center of it all, accepting congratulations with the practiced humility of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of appearing benevolent. He was 81 years old, but moved with the vigor of someone 20 years younger, his silver hair styled perfectly, his custom suit fitting like it had been painted on. Tonight he was receiving the Ashford Foundation's Humanitarian Award for his decades of philanthropic work and community service. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so obscene. Eleanor sat at the head table, rigid as a statue in emerald silk that matched the color of money and lies. Sarah watched her from across the ballroom, saw the way Eleanor's hands trembled slightly around her champagne flute, saw the tight set of her jaw beneath the perfect makeup. Castellano had insisted Eleanor attend tonight, had made it clear through channels that her absence would be noted and punished. For 40 years, Eleanor had danced to his tune, and tonight would be no different. Except tonight, everything was different. Sarah stood near the service entrance with Thomas beside her. Both of them dressed for the gala, but not really part of it, existing in the margins like ghosts waiting for their moment. Marcus Chun was positioned near the audiovisual booth, ready to take control of the screens. 2 Portland police detectives, friends of Thomas's from his college days, who'd agreed to be present based on the evidence they'd been shown, waited in an adjacent room. "Last chance to back out," Thomas murmured, though his eyes held the kind of determination that suggested backing out wasn't really an option he was considering. "I'm not backing out," Sarah said. Her mother was dying. Castellano had stolen 40 years from her aunt and built an empire on Cherokee land that wasn't his. Some things were worth the risk. The master of ceremonies began the program, introducing Castellano with a speech full of praise for his business acumen and charitable work. The audience applauded politely. Castellano stood, walked to the podium with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything, and began his acceptance speech. "I'm honored to receive this recognition," Castellano said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with practiced ease. "Throughout my career, I believe that true success isn't measured by what we accumulate, by what we give back to our communities." That's when the screens changed. The large displays positioned around the ballroom, meant to show tasteful photographs of Castellano's charitable works, suddenly filled with a different image. A photograph from 1984 showing 2 young women with their arms around each other, both wearing identical silver bracelets. The caption read, "Diana and Rachel Whitehorse, August 1984. The murmur that went through the crowd was immediate. Castellano's speech faltered. The screen split. On the left, the young Rachel from 1984. On the right, a recent photograph of Eleanor Ashford. The resemblance was undeniable. Same bone structure, same eyes, same mouth. Just 40 years of aging between them. "What is this?" Castellano demanded, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. Thomas stepped forward, walking into the light with the kind of calm that came from knowing you held all the cards. "This is the truth about who Eleanor Ashford really is, and about how you've been covering it up for 40 years. The screens changed again. Now they showed the 2 bracelets side by side, photographed under microscopic detail. The identical craftsmanship, the matching stones, the same crack in the 7th turquoise. Dr. Reeves's analysis appeared alongside the images her credentials listed, her conclusions damning in their scientific precision. "These bracelets were made together in 1967, Thomas continued, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "Only 2 were ever created. One belonged to Diana Whitehorse. The other belonged to her sister Rachel, who supposedly died in September 1985. Eleanor had gone absolutely white. Her hands gripped the edge of the table like she might fall without the support. The audio recording played next, Thomas Sr.'s voice, recorded sometime before his death, discovered in files he'd hidden in a safety deposit box that only became accessible after his passing. His words are shaky but clear. Victor threatened her whole family, said Rachel had to disappear or her sister would die. He arranged everything. The fake death, the new identity, even our marriage. I thought I was protecting her, but I was just another part of her prison." The ballroom erupted. People stood, shouted questions, pulled out phones to record. Castellano's face had gone from confident to furious, his carefully constructed mask cracking like ice under pressure. "This is absurd," Castellano said, his voice rising. This is a ridiculous fantasy concocted by your victim, Sarah interrupted, stepping forward into the light. She pulled out her phone and displayed the DNA results on the screen, official documentation from a lab, legally certified, impossible to dismiss. Eleanor Ashford submitted DNA 3 weeks ago through a private lab. I submitted mine. The results show a 99.4% probability that we share a grandparent. The number hung in the air like an executioner's blade. Sarah looked directly at Eleanor, at her aunt who'd lived in hiding for 40 years. Eleanor Ashford is Rachel Whitehorse. She's my aunt, and she disappeared because she witnessed Victor Castellano's illegal seizure of Cherokee territory in Oklahoma in 1985. The screens change again, showing documentation that Marcus had uncovered. Land deeds that had been fraudulently transferred, payments made to officials who looked the other way, a paper trail of theft that stretched from Oklahoma to Oregon and involved millions of dollars in stolen land that Castellano had sold to developers. Eleanor stood slowly, her whole body shaking. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught it and sent it throughout the ballroom. My name is Rachel Whitehorse. The words came out like a confession, like something she'd been holding inside for so long that releasing it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for 40 years. I was 23 years old when Victor Castellano threatened to kill my family if I didn't disappear. I saw him stealing Cherokee land, saw the documents, knew enough to destroy him. So he destroyed me instead. Tears ran down her face, cutting through makeup that had hidden her true identity for decades. He didn't just steal land. He stole my identity, my sister, my mother's last years. He forced me to marry Thomas Ashford to keep me under control, to make sure I stayed silent and compliant. I've lived in a cage made of money and fear for 40 years, and I watched my mother die thinking I'd abandon her. The ballroom was absolutely silent now, for 100 people bearing witness to a truth that was too terrible to look away from. Castellano's face had gone purple with rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Rachel, at Thomas, at Sarah. You can't prove any of this. These are lies, fabrications from people trying to steal my reputation. We have the land records, Thomas said calmly. We have your bank statements showing payments to silence Rachel. We have testimony from 3 of your former associates who've agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. We have everything, Victor. You have nothing, Castellano shouted, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering. That land was worthless before I developed it. Those people had no idea what to do with it. I made it valuable. I built something. You built an empire on stolen land and a woman's stolen life, Sarah said quietly. Castellano turned to her with eyes full of venom. Your grandmother was a drunk who couldn't manage her own affairs. Your mother was weak, and you're nothing but a waitress playing detective. This is my city. These are my people. You think you can destroy me with some old photographs and conspiracy theories? The admission hung in the air. Castellano realized his mistake a second too late, saw the phones recording, saw the witnesses absorbing every word. He just confirmed everything. The theft, the contempt, the decades of lies. The police detectives emerged from a side room, their presence suddenly official and inevitable. Victor Castellano, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit identity theft. The reading of his rights echoed through the ballroom. Guests backed away as if criminality might be contagious. Castellano's humanitarian award sat on the podium, meaningless now, a prop in a performance that had finally ended. Social media had already exploded. Multiple guests had live-streamed the entire confrontation. The view count climbed rapidly, 400,000, 800,000, 1,000,000 views in minutes. By the time Castellano was let out in handcuffs, 2.4 million people had watched a powerful man's empire collapse in real time, watched justice delivered on a stage meant for celebration. Rachel stood in the center of the ballroom, no longer Eleanor Ashford, no longer the carefully constructed lie she'd been forced to inhabit. She was just Rachel Whitehorse, survivor, finally free after 40 years of captivity. Subscribe before this kind of truth slips back into darkness, where powerful men prefer it. 3 months later, winter had arrived in Portland with a kind of cold that made everything feel clean and new. like the city itself was being washed of old sins. The legal aftermath had been swift and brutal. Castellano's assets were seized. $87 million recovered from various accounts and properties, much of it traced directly back to the stolen Cherokee land. His carefully constructed network of associates and enablers had collapsed like dominoes, each one racing to cut deals and testify against the others. The development project in Oklahoma, worth $200 million and built entirely on fraudulently obtained land, was halted immediately. The land returned to Cherokee Tribal Authority along with $15 million in restitution for decades of illegal use. Sarah sat in her mother's hospital room at Mercy Hospital, watching Diana sleep peacefully. The experimental treatment had worked, not a cure, because pancreatic cancer didn't really allow for cures, but remission that the doctors cautiously described as remarkable. Diana's skin had regained some of its color, the yellow tinge fading as her liver recovered. The oxygen mask was gone, replaced by a simple nasal cannula. The morphine drip had been reduced to manageable pain medication. The hospital bills, all $87,000 of them, plus the $120,000 for the experimental treatment, had been paid in full from the recovered Castellano assets. Sarah had cried when the hospital administrator told her, cried until she couldn't breathe, cried for all the nights she'd lain awake doing impossible math in her head. The door opened and Rachel entered, carrying 2 cups of decent coffee from the shop down the street. She'd stopped trying to be Eleanor, stopped wearing the expensive clothes and the careful makeup. She looked younger now somehow, despite being 63 years old, despite the lines that 40 years of fear had carved into her face. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, and on her wrist was the silver bracelet that had started everything. "She's still sleeping," Sarah said softly. "Good. She needs the rest." Rachel sat in the other chair, the one she'd occupied for hours every day since being reunited with her sister. The lawyer called. "The identity restoration paperwork is complete. I'm officially Rachel Whitehorse again, at least in the eyes of the law." Diana's eyes opened, still groggy but alert. She looked at her sister, really looked at her, like she still couldn't quite believe Rachel was real and not another morphine-induced hallucination. "You came back," Diana whispered. "I never want to leave," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "Not for a single day in 40 years. I watched you from a distance, send anonymous donations when I could, try to protect you the only way I knew how. You saved my life." Diana reached out and Rachel took her hand, and Sarah watched her mother and aunt hold onto each other like they were drowning, and each other was the only thing keeping them afloat. "Castellano said he'd kill me if he didn't disappear. You sacrificed everything to keep me safe." "I'd do it again," Rachel said simply. 8,000 times over. They sat in silence for a while, 3 generations of Whitehorse women in a hospital room that had seen so much suffering but was now filled with something that felt almost like peace. Sarah pulled out the small wooden box she'd brought from home and opened it to reveal both bracelets sitting side by side, reunited after 40 years of separation, just like the sisters who'd worn them. "Grandmother would have loved this," Diana said, touching the bracelets with gentle fingers. "Then let's show her," Rachel replied. 2 weeks later, they stood together at Lily Whitehorse's grave in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. The cemetery was small and well-maintained, surrounded by trees that had shed their leaves for winter. Lily's headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and a Cherokee blessing carved into the stone, the same blessing that was inscribed on the bracelets. Rachel and Diana wore the bracelets, silver catching the weak winter sunlight. Sarah stood between them, one hand on each of their shoulders, completing the circle that had been broken for so long. "We're home, Mama," Rachel said to the grave. "Both of us. Finally." They'd used a portion of the recovered Castellano money to establish the Lily Whitehorse Justice Center for Missing Indigenous Women, a foundation dedicated to investigating cold cases and supporting families of missing persons. The center would be headquartered in Tahlequah, staffed by professional investigators and victim advocates, funded in perpetuity by assets seized from the man who'd caused so much pain. Sarah had been named executive director at a salary of $85,000 a year, more money than she'd ever imagined making, doing work that mattered more than anything she'd done before. Thomas Ashford Jr. had agreed to serve on the board and provide additional funding. Together, they'd already begun investigating 3 other cases that bore suspicious similarities to Rachel's disappearance, young indigenous women who'd vanished under questionable circumstances, their cases closed too quickly, their families dismissed too easily. Rachel had started writing her memoir, tentatively titled The Bracelet That Remembered. Publishers were already in a bidding war for the rights. The story had captured national attention, not just the dramatic confrontation at the gala, but the deeper questions about identity, family, and the price of survival. Rachel was determined to use her platform to shine light on the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, to make sure her story served a purpose beyond her own liberation. And Diana, miraculously, was cancer-free according to her most recent scans. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, talking about years instead of weeks, talking about quality of life instead of palliative care. She'd moved to Portland to be close to both her daughters, because that's how she thought of Sarah now, as her daughter rather than her niece, the child who'd saved them all by refusing to accept convenient lies. They left flowers at Lily's grave, wild roses that Lily had loved, that still grew in Oklahoma despite the cold. As they walked back to the rental car, Sarah looked at her mother and her aunt, at the bracelets they wore, at the bond that 40 years and a conspiracy and death itself hadn't been able to break. True wealth isn't what you inherit. It's having the courage to fight for truth, even when the world tells you it's impossible. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in bank vaults. They're found in the unbreakable bonds of family, and the silver bracelets that refuse to let us forget who we really are beneath the lies others force us to wear. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Rachel Whitehorse became one of those rare cultural moments that transcended the usual news cycle. The video of Castellano's arrest at the gala had been viewed over 50 million times. News outlets picked up the story, though most of them focused on the dramatic confrontation rather than the deeper issues of systemic erasure of Indigenous women. But the people who mattered understood. The families of missing women who reached out to the Lily Whitehorse Justice Center understood. The Cherokee Nation, which honored Rachel at a special ceremony and formally recognized her courage, understood. The other survivors who'd been silenced by powerful men and found hope in Rachel's liberation understood. Sarah stood in the Foundation's new office in Tahlequah 6 months after the gala, looking at the wall where they'd posted photographs of the women they were investigating. 12 faces stared back at her. 12 families still searching for answers, still hoping for impossible reunions like the one Sarah had been given. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. Scan still clear. Doctor says, I'm officially in long-term remission. Love you, baby. Sarah smiled, saved the message, and returned to her work. There were more bracelets out there, she thought. More impossible coincidences waiting to be noticed. More truths waiting to be uncovered by someone stubborn enough to refuse the easy answers and brave enough to face the dangerous ones. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that truth matters more than convenience and family matters more than fear, then share it with someone who needs to believe that justice is still possible. Hit subscribe so you never miss stories of people who refused to accept the world's lies and fought for the truth instead. And drop a comment below. Have you ever discovered something that changed everything you thought you knew about your family? Because sometimes the greatest mysteries are hiding in plain sight, wrapped around someone's wrist, waiting 40 years for someone to finally see them. The bracelet still sat on Sarah's desk, reunited, cleaned, polished, perfect. 2 pieces of silver and turquoise that had traveled through decades of separation and pain to finally rest side by side where they belonged. They caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a promise. That what is broken can be mended, that what is lost can be found, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way home.